Okay, that was Gloria Gaynor with her 1972 classic I Will Survive. A good way to start because it has a two-pronged meaning for today's lessons. Number one, and perhaps of secondary importance, this is our last lesson, lesson 11 on the changing role of women. Mr. Suter and myself have grown quite fond of this microphone, talking to you, bringing you these lessons from our heart, and we will survive. However, most importantly, it has to do with the changing role of women in Britain and how women have begun the process of emancipation from years, hundreds of years of patriarchy and oppression. Now, the changing role of women, the feminism and the women's liberation movement, which come to symbolize a women's actual pursuing of the goal of equality, change more because of the growth of feminist ideas and the actual formation of a group of something called the women's liberation movement. These were heavily influenced by America, so this is not something that necessarily started in Britain first. It was something that really got the wind in its sails from the United States, primarily due to the work of Betty Friedan, who published a book called The Feminine Mystique, which became an international bestseller in 1963. Quite an interesting book, actually. She interviewed, Betty Friedan did, women who she went to school with several years later and saw what they were doing with their lives and asked them questions about the degree of happiness they felt with their lives. And the story she told in The Feminine Mystique really resonated with a lot of women who felt a deep sense of unsatisfaction with their role in life, their position in society, and the such. These are educated and very highly intelligent women, in every way as capable of their men's counterparts, but for the majority of them, they felt themselves sort of, I hesitate to use the term enslaved, but certainly kept back by society and male's perception of them. By the late 1960s, the feminist movement will emerge in Britain.
So by the 1970s, the women's liberation movement has established groups in every city, but particularly within the universities. Universities, obviously, because they had a lot of middle-class women who saw their careers would be stunted by the current rules as they are, who are also more politically active, and in environments which are more conducive to being politically active, you're amongst like-minded people, so you can form organisations. They had four key demands, and they were basically, what they saw as the four main things women needed to be equal to men. And that was equal pay between men and women, equal education and career opportunities between men and women, free contraception and abortion on demand, and freely available 24-hour childcare. What this is looking for is giving women social and economic independence around what they do with their bodies, but also how they pursue their career. If a woman wants to pursue a career and not have kids, that should be her right. Otherwise, she is consigned to be a mother, and therefore the second sex, as it were, well, somewhat lower than that of the man.
Okay, the methods of the feminist movement are quite interesting. The first and most obvious was protest. Many marches are held through the late 1960s into the 1970s, of course. Unsurprisingly, this 1968 was a year of increased rise in feminism because as protest, like the student movements we learned about last lesson, take off, women see that this is an effective way of getting attention, and they're empowered by their the student counterparts, and they protest protest for equality and a change in the way society is run as well. The most notable protests was the 1970 protest of the Miss World competition at Royal Albert Hall. For anyone who's not familiar with the Miss World competition, it's an international competition where a country sends a female representative to the competition. Now they compete in such categories as bathing suit wearing and their opinions on current events and things like that, mostly done in bathing suits. For many, it's an incredibly demeaning competition. For others, not so much, but nevertheless, it's very much in 1970, especially, and well, let's be honest, not that far off today, a symbol of patriarchy and a woman's different role in society, if you will. Women also notably burnt bras. Bras were a symbol of female difference. The bras were also a symbol of motherhood and the sort of restrictions of motherhood, if you will. The burning of bras came to symbolize freedom from the need to be mothers, the need to raise children if they wanted to. The second major way they got their message out there was through the publication of books. Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch, published in 1970, is after Betty Friedan's book, the most widely read piece of feminist literature. It basically argues that women are repressed by the traditional roles within the family, and this was incredibly controversial. Talk shows, radio call-in shows were full of people saying that women weren't oppressed, and women arguing, yes, we were. And you know, the people who called in weren't necessarily men. Some women just plain didn't agree with this. But Germaine Greer's Female Eunuch starts a conversation that was very important, that continues in many ways to this day. And third is the role of key individuals. In the late 1960s, women start to take positions in society slowly and in very, very small numbers that perhaps weren't available to them before. And as such, the outstanding job they do a lot for proving to people that women can do just as much as men. When I speak of this in Britain, you talk notably of Barbara Castle and Shirley Williams. These people were influential in Harold Wilson's Labour government of the late 1960s. Castle especially is everywhere in the 1960s. She's a first-rate political star and a very important campaigner for women's rights. Actress Vanessa Redgrave, who is a phenomenal actress if you ever get a chance to see her, especially live. She's doing a lot of work in the West End these days. But anyways, Vanessa Redgrave openly supports political campaigns, and as a very famous actress, both on this side of the Atlantic and the other, that is in the United States, Vanessa Redgrave's opinion has a lot of gravitas.
So, one of the first and probably most successful areas of fighting was for equal pay. It's very hard to sustain an argument, particularly going into and past the 60s, that women should be paid less than men for equal work. And by the mid-1950s, government had introduced equal pay for civil servants, so people who work for the government, teachers, and people who work in local government. But the vast majority of people don't actually work in these environments, they work in the private sector. And before then, the government had said it's up to individual businesses to make their own decisions if they want to give equal pay or not. Their argument was if women didn't like it, they could go elsewhere. Obviously, that doesn't quite match up to reality when you've got commitments or geographical factors mean that you have to work in the local place. One of the most famous fights for pay equality was the Ford strikes in Dagenham. Now, some of you may have seen or heard of the TV program, the film, and also the play Made in Dagenham, which is about this. And basically, women who work at these Ford car plants in Dagenham protest for 3 weeks. Has a lot of very positive support amongst the public, and to some outlets and news media, more right-wing news media, is kind of against this. And Barbara Castle steps in the end and won a deal that gave them over 90% of what men made. So it's a victory, but it's 90%. This is followed by the 1970 Equal Pay Act, which promised equal wages for men and women by 1975. Now, this seems like a very beautiful thing, and there are massive problems with this, because in reality, how do you make sure that someone complies by this, and there's plenty of reports, even to this day, of the fact that women are paid on average less than men. And part of the reason for this was Britain was broke, and they needed to join the EEC. That's the EU nowadays, okay? But it used to be called the EEC, the European Economic Community. And so, in order to join this, they had to show that they gave women equal wages, so they very quickly passed the Equal Wage Act in order to get part of the European Economic Community. So there hadn't really been a shift in attitude, it was just more convenient for Britain to give them equal equal wages, so that the economy can stay afloat.
Other key changes by the mid-1970s include the 1975 Sexual Discrimination Act. What this act meant is it was illegal to discriminate women on the grounds of gender in employment, education, and housing. So renters who wouldn't rent to young single women were no longer allowed to have this provision in the rental contracts. It was illegal to discriminate in terms of employment, the sort of gender stereotypes that belay a lot of certain jobs, including service in the military, that's a man's role. These things changed with the Sexual Discrimination Act in 1975, and employment needs to be non-gender specific from now on in all industries. Education, same thing, access to schooling, this is the end of boys-only clubs, boys-only schools, whereby, preventing female entrance is forbidden at that point. Some schools continue on, but they probably wouldn't stand up to a challenge under the Sexual Discrimination Act. Also in 1975, you get the Employment Protection Act, and this is important for women. It really what can't be understated how difficult it is to raise a child and work at the same time. And the Employment Protection Act prevents a common practice amongst British employers is once a woman gets pregnant, that they either remove her job, they don't pay her for her maternity leave. A lot of women would find that they would go off and have a baby and then lose their job within 2 weeks of giving birth, and it's completely unrealistic expectation for a woman to return to work in such a short period of time. So the Employment Protection Act was there to prevent against discrimination of pregnant women and the removal of the positions of pregnant women once they had given birth. It gave a mandatory 6 weeks maternity pay for any woman with 2 years of service. That means 2 years in that company, and entitled them to keep their jobs for 29 weeks, so approximately 6 months or so after the birth of their child. And this meant that it was illegal then, within those time frames, for a woman to be replaced. They could hire temporary work, but the work had to be just that, temporary, and that woman would have to return to the job she had with no reduction in pay, no reduction in position or responsibility.
So, in some ways there are positive changes. By the mid-1970s, women are increasingly experiencing more liberal attitudes towards women's acceptability to return to work after birth. Before that, it seems almost a cardinal sin and almost reckless to leave your children when they should be being raised by their mothers. It was seen women were more likely to continue education and more likely to continue and push for careers in finance, law, and medicine, which had been up until this point seen as intellectually too difficult for women or improper for women to uptake, because they will be married at 23, and so therefore what's the point, because they will stop working again. We also see the 1969 Divorce Reform Act, which meant that women could divorce without adultery being committed. This gives quite a lot of equality to marriages, in the sense that yes, women would still have to prove certain things, that the relationship had reached an irretrievable breakdown, which meant that both sides, or one side, really were not compatible and did not work well with the other side. However, it meant that most women, if they were in a bad marriage, had the option to leave, and that's a very, very big shift, because if the husband knows the wife could leave, or it's easier for the wife to leave, he might start treating her more equal, and if he doesn't, the woman can escape the marriage to some extent, and therefore be relatively free. This is very quickly followed up by the 1970 Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act. This is because women getting divorced in 1969 suddenly found themselves absolutely destitute. They had no money, they had no house to give them because they usually kicked out because the houses were usually in the male's name, okay, and because they hadn't been working, because they'd been doing housework and looking after kids, when lawyers and judges saw the contribution to the family, it was decided since a woman hadn't earned any money, she should not be given any property. Now, to reverse that, what the 1970 Act said was that if women are working at the home, particularly looking after kids, that will be considered, and therefore, if you have been raising kids for 18 years and you get divorced, you have been essentially working for 18 years much like your husband. So you're entitled to half, or broadly half, the amount of property. What this enables women to do is they can get divorced without fearing becoming absolutely destitute, and gives a degree of financial security. And this is a key thing, because even if you can be divorced, if you know you're going to be absolutely broke and struggle to survive to a greater or lesser extent, then you're far less likely to divorce and more likely to stay in unhappy or even violent marriages. But now you have that security, you're more likely to leave.
And receive a quality settlement in return.
One job. Press the button once.
How much change? On the surface, a lot of this stuff seems very good, and let's be honest, women do come a good ways in towards achieving equality through the 1960s and into the 1970s. However, there was quite a lot of bad things. Women were still disproportionately employed in low-paid skilled work. Women are underrepresented in senior management. There seems to be what's known as a glass ceiling. The term glass ceiling, of course, refers to the idea that there's an invisible barrier towards upward progression that a woman would run into, and therefore keep her down because of her gender. Many women feel pressurized. For those women who take on work or go out in the work world and want to have a home life, they have a double burden put on them of having to prove themselves in the workplace and at home. And say what you will and think what you will of Mrs. Thatcher, she has some very, very powerful thoughts on the inequality of the double burden put on women in the 1970s, as she relates her own experience as a member of Parliament and trying to raise her family with almost little assistance from real assistance from her husband, and the public, of course, putting quite a bit of pressure on her as well. Women are underrepresented in politics. Back to Margaret Thatcher again. She's one of the few examples of successful women at this time. In fact, you can actually bookend this course with the fact that in 1979 she will become the first female prime minister of her country. The cartoon here, I think, is telling. This is a cartoon by Phil Evans, a relatively famous satirist, who showing a cleaner discovering that the Equal Pay Act had been swept under the cover, and this comes from a 1982 Trade Union Resource Center publication.
So, what didn't change? By the Sun, under Rupert Murdoch, releases and starts the idea of page free. For those who have not heard of this, these are topless models, usually on obviously the third page, which are designed to get more and more men, red-blooded males, buying the Sun, and it works as a treat. Sun sales go up massively as a result of this. There were still women's magazines, Good Housekeeping, for example, which focused on traditional gender roles. The idea that women want to know about dieting, romance, fashion, and family. And there is very much a sense that there is a female sphere. Females do this, which is family, fashion, looking pretty, looking dainty, cooking, cleaning, and men do this: sports, running, drinking, and there's still those defined gender roles. As part of that, there's the children's toys that reinforce these traditional roles. Barbie and Jane are for girls, Action Man, Johnny's series are for boys. And what a lot of feminists argue is that if you give dolls and makeup to young female girls and female children, then what will happen is they will grow up thinking that's so normal, and they're expecting to be a mother and expecting to be looking after things, and boys will expect to be aggressive and expect to be out the house. And what you're doing is you're training the next generation to undertake the same gender roles as that generation, and you're not leading to any progress. And there's still a sense in school, even at this point, that certain subjects, particularly the hands-on subjects and the more academically rigorous subjects such as physics, chemistry, and obviously history, were for boys, whereas cookery, typing, and relatively menial and housekeeping topics, for example, home economics, is still very, very popular at this point, were for girls. So there's still that reinforcement that women are X and men are Y, and both, when young children should grow up in a particular direction and accept the same vision of femininity and masculinity as their forefathers and foremothers in that case.
So that brings us towards the end of our course.
It's been emotional.
Here we are. We've looked at Britain from 1951 to 1979, and we've seen tremendous amounts of change in this country. A country that, at the start of this course, had an empire. At the end of this course, had the winter of discontent and couldn't keep the lights on. But by 1979, a lot of the battles that needed to be fought were fought. Progress was being made, and the modern world was being shaped. In many ways, Britain, because of the era we talked about, will never be the same. Mr. Suter and I would like to leave you with a song from a young Elton John, 1972, Rocket Man. Sit back and enjoy. Lonely out space. Oh, I just love this part. It's gonna be a long, long time. Touchdown brings me round again to find I'm the man that think I am at home. Oh, no, 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 no. Rocket Man! Rocket Man! It's gonna be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again to find not the man that think I am at home. Oh, no, no, no.
My Rocket Man!
Rocket Man!
I feel alone.
I'm welling up. There'll be an A level before you know it. GCSE's all over now. And there's no one there to raise them. Every day. They grow so quick.
You spend far too much time in this room, man.
5 days a week. This is the last verse. Come on, let's go with it. Rocket Man!
That's not even the words. It's just making noises.
I think it's gonna be a long, long time. Touchdown brings me round again to find I'm not the man I think I am at home. No, 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 no.
Rocket Man!
Rocket Man!
Please get out more.
Oh, no, no, no. I'm a Rocket Man. gonna be a long, long time.
Be a long, long time.
Think it's gonna
Be a long, long time. Think it's gonna be a long time.
All right, in all seriousness, good luck on your exams. Study hard.